From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Like her previous works, her latest work, The Ugly Duchess, is on the New York Times bestseller list. While she and her alter ego, Dr. Mary Bly, routinely and comfortably, it appears, move between the past and the present, today is a definite historic first for her. This is her first appearance at the National Book Festival. After her speech today and her presentation and answering your questions, she will be signing her book in lane 6 of book signing. So you can quickly run down there past book sales and get your book signed. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Eloisa James and her alter ego to our favorite neighborhood book party.
Hello. Thank you for coming. I just want to say thank you very much for coming, and I have to do something I promised, which is give a shout out to my daughter, who's here somewhere, age 13 back there. So I just want to start. I'm the first romance writer ever invited to the National Book Fair. So I think it's important because I think that we need to be talking not just about our greatest books, but also about the books that everyone really likes to read a lot. And I say that knowing my father's a poet, so I know exactly what his print run was. So I have knowledge on both sides of the aisle. I just want to start by telling you how I got into this place. I really have two identities. I am, as she said, Dr. Mary Bly, so I'm a Shakespeare professor at Fordham University, and I'm also Eloisa James, and I've written 22 best-selling romances. And romance, in a sense, is the bottom of the literary canon. So I go from the top to the bottom. I actually think that pornography has more of an edge these days. I'm stuck where I am. So I grew up, my father was Robert Bly. He won the National Book Award for Poetry. Yay. He was invited to this festival. I grew up in a very literary household. We didn't have a television. The house was completely full of books. My mother, Carol Bly, was a short story writer. So our entire lives revolved around great literature. And I was the Philistine in this family because my father liked poetry and would recite it every night at dinner. My mother preferred lugubrious Russian novelists and would, constantly bring them up. And I just liked passion. I wanted anyone. I would read Jane Austen. I would read anyone. And this bothered my family a lot. So finally, my father made a deal. For every romance you read, you have to read a classic. So I know you are all literary readers. I bet I'm the only one that has read the entire collected works of Mark Twain. My grandmother had a lot of Barbara Cartlands, and I had to get there. So I sometimes wonder, how did I get, I am Simon and Garfunkel, born into the Bach family, I don't know exactly where my talent came, but at some point I had to say, this is my talent. This is what I've got. And I just have to accept it. I got an email this morning from a very passionate, young, Harvard-educated feminist saying, you must not denigrate the genre when you're here. And I was thinking about the difference. For me, there is a difference between literature and genre fiction. And I think it's an important one. I think it's one that we need to talk about and not pretend doesn't exist. So my mother would sum it up as a real book. She hated romance. So the day she died, she didn't read any of mine because she said they were that sex stuff, which is kind of true. But she always said, before she died, she said, you're going to write a real book in 5 years. It was one of the last things she said to me. My siblings all burst into laughter. They thought that New York Times bestsellers were real books. But what I want to do is get past that place of the real book. I was lucky enough to see Mario Vargas Llosa speak on Friday night, and I think what he's going to tell you after me is that we need good books. Good books and real books are a category that has an adjective attached to them that needn't be thought of in a pejorative or a non-pejorative way. Ugly Duchess, for example, the book I have out right now, is a good book. It got starred reviews from Publishers Weekly, from Library Journal, from Booklist. It got the trifecta, right? So I'm very happy with that. But I think that there is a difference. My mother, I'm a very dutiful oldest daughter. So 4 months and about 4 years and about 5 months after my mother died, I published Paris in Love, which is a memoir. Came out with Random House. It's extremely elegant. It has a lovely cover. It's a real book, except she wouldn't think it's a real book. And the reason she wouldn't think it is that it's a memoir about the year when we escaped to Paris. My mother died. I was diagnosed with breast cancer 2 weeks later. So we sold our house, we sold our cars, we uprooted the children from all their virtuous activities like soccer, and we just fled to Paris. We rented an apartment on the internet, and we went. And I wrote the memoir to capture that year, and also to try to say to people, we don't have to be so afraid. I don't speak French. I had a great time. The French were very nice to me. If you have a credit card and a big smile, you'll be fine. It was fine. So I think, though, she would particularly resent the fact that I put a guide in the back to the museums and the shops I liked. That's not a real book because it's not going to change the way our nation thinks of anything. It's not going to change a whole country. When Mr. Vargas Llosa comes up here, his books have actually instigated change, and that's a huge difference. Real books, so-called, and my books do very different things. Now, Catch-22 is the example that I often give my students, because that book actually changed the way we, America, thought about war. And Catch-22 is about World War II, which is an enormously just war. It's a war that we had to be involved in, and yet that novel made us all think about that war in a different way. So I don't write about grief and death, right? But these books, every book has its own place, and I would say that grief and death come to me. So rather than me creating them in the world and making you think I have to go change the world, my books don't change the world, but they may change you. I'm going to give you an example of the kind of change that I think my books do. So I wrote a book called Midnight Pleasures, and I have to say I'm using this as an example because Anna is here. I was very much afraid of going into premature labor. I had done it with my first child, and I poured my fear of losing a baby into Midnight Pleasures. My heroine loses her child at 5 months. That child dies, of course, because my books are set in the 1800s. So I turned in my book, and at 24 weeks, at 5 months, I gave birth to Anna, who's over there, completely healthy. But I got a lot of the details wrong. Anna was red. My baby was, the baby in my book was white and gorgeous. And, if you know anything about premature children, that's not where they're at. But my point was I took all of my fear and I poured it into that book. And I got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters. So I'm just going to read you part of one. I just finished reading Patrick and Sophie's story for the billionth time, and I want to thank you for writing it. I don't know if you ever personally experienced infant loss, but our second daughter died at 41 weeks gestation. The way you write Sophie's emotions, her fear of guilt, her fear it was her fault, her knowledge that her body failed her, it's all true. And to read it so raw, so acknowledged, never fails to move me and to bring me back to my own loss, but not in a bad way, but just as vivid. Also, what Patrick felt like. Patrick was my hero. Holding Frances, the baby, knowing that Sophie would want to know what she looked like. That is exactly how my husband was. He memorized all my baby's features, even though I held her, even though we took the pictures to last a lifetime. He knew I wouldn't remember everything I wanted to, and he tried to do it for me. So what I'm saying is, the kind of books, the kind of romances that I write live or die on that level of passion and that level of individual emotion that I was able to put in the book through I have not experienced infant loss, but through my imagining of that. So Vargas Llosa won the Nobel Prize. I would say that my particular Nobel Prize is a letter like that. Or it's a letter that I just got from a 14-year-old saying that The Ugly Duchess is better than Twilight, which I was like, hey, like that. Or another one that I recently got where a woman had sat next to her sister in the hospice and read a book aloud, and her sister laughed. It's the individual triumphs that matter with this kind of book, and it's an individual triumph that can change someone's life, one person's life. So going back to grief and death, the things that my parents taught me were part of literature. I mean, my father read us Beowulf. He howled Beowulf to us. My mother cried reading Charlotte's Web. It was all about violence, death, and tears, right? Those come to me because they live or die based on those moments. So I want to give you an example of what a romance is like, because it's a very different project to write a romance, I think, than it is to write literary fiction. For one thing, I have a very, very big audience, and I know many literary writers here do as well, so I'm basing this solely on my father's audience, okay? I have to write on many different levels because my readers are coming to my books for very different things. The 14-year-old who liked the same book that the woman who'd suffered the loss of her baby are meeting in very different places in that book. They're bringing something very different. So I'm going to give you an example from a book I wrote called When Beauty Tamed the Beast. I'm rewriting fairy tales right now. This is something of a tribute to my father, who wrote a book called Iron John. So the whole time I was growing up, he would say, well, why was Peter climbing why was he climbing the beanstalk? Think about it. And he'd be like, none of my siblings write literature, and this is why, frankly. But no. At some point, I thought, I'm going to do this as a tribute to him. I'm going to do the things that he taught us to do. So I'm going to rewrite fairy tales. So when you're writing a fairy tale, or you're writing any kind of genre fiction, the key thing is that you surprise the reader within the bounds of what they already know. In a literary fiction, anything could happen. In a romance, you know from what you pick up that the dream of that book is that you can have a long, sensual, thoughtful, respectful relationship between two people of whatever gender. It's already promised. So I have to surprise the reader within the bounds of that. I have to make them think, this book isn't going to work, right? That's what you have to do in a mystery, too. This one isn't going to be solved. There's a dream at the heart of every genre fiction that has to be dispelled in the middle. Well, if you add in a fairy tale, I now have to surprise a reader who knows perfectly well how The Ugly Duchess ends, or what Beauty and the Beast is about, right? So I have that double thing. Now I'm going to add on a third layer. I was inspired when I was thinking about beasts by Dr. House, MD, the Fox TV show. I mean, he's a beast, right? But what really inspired me was not Dr. Fox, or not Dr. House. It was the fact that he solves all of his stuff with thousands and thousands of tests, which, of course, the insurance company would never let him do, but, whatever. I was thinking in the 1800s, what would a doctor do who had his level of intelligence and his level of arrogance? So I found a doctor. His name, I've written down here, his name is Dr. A. Phillips Wilson, and he published a treatise of febrile diseases in 1799. And in this book, he said, all of you idiot doctors have killed all your patients from scarlet fever, and I have never lost a patient. Well, this became, I based a lot of the book on him. It became quickly clear he had to be lying, mostly because I got letters from doctors now within a couple weeks of the book coming out, because I have a huge medical audience. Again, people get tired. They get tired of whatever, they turn to romance. And one woman wrote me and said, I just lost a patient to scarlet fever. Another one wrote me and said, I was in the hospital with a mystery disease, an interesting disease, which of course is the worst thing you can have. And her friend went down to the gift shop and bought her a book and brought it up. And she didn't read it, unfortunately, until she was sent out of the hospital with scarlet fever. They had diagnosed it. She got home, she wrote me, she said all the symptoms were right. Unfortunately, they're unpleasant symptoms. So I had that second layer, which is about history, because we readers have an enormous desire to learn, but not necessarily to have an information dump in the middle of a book. But you want to keep reading, you want to keep learning, you want to see this story shape. And then I had a fourth layer in this book, which is a poem by T.S. Eliot, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. So if you read that book, you will see the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock appear and disappear. The question, do I wear my trousers rolled? Do I wait? Do I dare? And do I dare? And will I drown? And will the mermaids catch me? Or will I be woken by a human voice? That comes and goes throughout the book. You don't need to know that. You don't need to know that Dr. House has any part in it. You don't really need to know the story of Beauty Tames the Beast. None of that. But all of it is available on different layers, on different levels for whoever wants it. And I have to say, this is something that I learned from Shakespeare. This is teaching Shakespeare day in, day out, because he had to write for the groundlings, and he wrote for the aristocracy. He wrote on very, very many different levels. So I try to kind of follow that. So what I'm trying to do then is a literary fiction teaches you to fight your own world, perhaps, to learn what you should learn and what to fight against. Mine teaches very small lessons. So The Ugly Duchess, the book that just got all those starred reviews, has one very small lesson. Ugly is a word that we use never to describe, always to insult, always to hurt. So how am I going to shape a book around that realization without just turning it into a moral lesson, which is incredibly boring, right? So I chose a heroine in the 1800s, and I based her on a supermodel now with an extremely strong, mannish face and body, which of course was incredibly ugly in the 1800s. So she is my ugly duchess. She's married to a man who's tremendously beautiful, and the marriage falls apart. He goes away, becomes a pirate, because I like pirates, my first pirate, and he gets tattooed, and he comes back. Now he's singing like Leonard Cohen, right? He is now ugly. He has a tattoo on his face. He has a broken voice. They switch places. So the ugly becomes the beautiful because she, like Coco Chanel, by the time he comes back from being a pirate, has become the arbiter of beauty in London and Parisian society. So I switched them in this wonderful way. And you know what? The book tied for number 5 on the New York Times list. That means that I've already waded through hundreds of letters, lots and lots of them. And the thing is, some people will say that. Some people will see part of it. Some people will just say, I love the heroine. I felt ugly my whole life. Some people will just say, were you thinking about Coco Chanel? You know, some people will just say, I really want a pirate. And people come from all different directions. A lot of people will say, I want to hear another pirate. In other words, their way of response is just to say, I want more. Please, I've had a hard week. This got me through this week. Please write another one, give me another pirate. So that's the only thing I think that can make a genre fiction novel fail is boredom, is the reader's boredom, right? You can actually kind of keep reading if you're bored with poetry. My students tell me this constantly. Shakespeare's sonnets are boring. I say, keep reading. I'm quizzing you at the end. You have to keep going. So I'm going to read you another letter, because a lot of my life is made up of these readers' letters. Dear Eloisa, I started the first book of the Duchess Quartet and found it tedious, so I skipped several chapters. As I continue with the next book, I found myself reading 1 or 2 pages, then skipping 30 pages and reading 1 or 2 again. This way, I read all the remaining books in the series. I found your books very, very repetitive. The books were so long and boring. It was like reading a Gabriel Garcia Marquez book. So again, I would say, the reader brings herself to your book, and she finds what she's going to find in there, whether it's in your book or it's in Gabriel Garcia Marquez. The biggest thing I could say about romance, the biggest definition of romance, is the hope that there is a secret, hidden order to the world, right? I don't mean this religiously. I just mean that there is a secret architecture, and at the heart of it is love, whether that is love between a man and a woman, between women and children. Doesn't really matter. The romance promises that that's important, and that is the most important. So, Salman Rushdie called this the secret identity of a book. If you don't bring that secret architecture, your interest in that architecture to the book, you're likely not going to find it. It's going to be really boring for you, which is probably why I have so few male readers. I do have some, but they're mostly incarcerated, which, holds them down their possibilities for love are muted. So I want to go back to where I started with my father. He really raised us to become great people of literature. Consequently, my 3 siblings all are in business and very happily doing so. But I found myself there, and because I was the eldest daughter, I used to earn my money by helping him be a writer. And he had in his study, had a bathroom, it had a huge bathtub. And the bathtub was completely filled with readers' letters. Because, they don't have email, so they were actually physically sending letters. So every time I needed some money, I would go out to his study and I'd say, okay, let's do some work. And I would pluck a letter out, rip it open, and read it aloud. And I would sit on his little upright. I was between 8 and 12 years old. I did it for years. And I would read aloud the poem, because they always said poems. And then Dad would say, that poem is really terrible. Say, dear young poet, your poetry's awful. Get a job, But he always insisted that I identify myself. So many people have come up to me and said, I have one of your letters. Because I would say, I'm Robert Bly's daughter. And I actually thought the dog was kind of nice. And I think you should keep writing, but Dad says you should get a job. So I was already veering in the direction of romance as I see it, veering towards optimism. So I'm gonna finish with that idea of the bathtub of letters, which in my case becomes a bathtub that's a huge inbox. I want to finish with one more letter. This is from someone named Bob. Dear Ms. Eloisa James, I was looking for information about Egypt on the internet. I typed E into Google, and I ended up at your website. Wow, what a layout, what accomplishments, what promotions, what superlatives, what testimonials, what a life. At first I thought this person must be an actor on TV, or Hollywood, or Broadway maybe. How do you rate all this stuff? Frankly, I think it's all overdone. Is it necessary to sell books? Well, come to think of it, there is another writer who has a similar website, Nicholas Sparks. Not much humility in either one of you. So there I am, right? I have the bathtub. I could write him back and say something like, don't give up your day job. You're never going to be a writer. But instead, I'm going to give you my answer, and then I'm done. And if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Dear Bob, thank you very much for contacting EloisaJames.com. You are now added to Eloisa's email list and will be receiving daily, if not hourly, updates on her many accomplishments. She will personally inform you of each new degree she receives. We have automatically Googled you and added your home address and entered you into the sweepstakes to win a lover's trip to San Domingo in the Love Boat. If you win, Eloisa will pay and the Chippendale dancers will come to Akron, Ohio and dance for you. Thank you so, so much for your kind words and support of Eloisa's accomplishments and books. It's fans like you, says Eloisa, who make her what she is. Hugs, Eloisa's team. I just want to say, in case Bob is in the audience, he was absolutely lovely and wrote me back it took me all evening to compose that. He wrote me back a lovely apology. So, at any rate, thank you. So, please come and ask me some questions. We have 15 minutes, I think.
My question is, did you have any other Regency romance writers as inspiration? I personally like Georgette Heyer and Patricia Varian.
Yes.
And both of them, I find the layers that you talked about that you try to incorporate.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you're absolutely right. I was growing up in a small town. I was actually growing up in a farm because, we had no money, right? So we lived on one of my grandfather's farms outside a town of 2,000. It's called Madison, Minnesota. And there was, thank goodness, a Carnegie Public Library, because otherwise I wouldn't have had any romance to read, really. My grandma had one now and then. So I discovered Georgette Heyer. And when they ask me, what is the book, I keep getting asked this, what decision to read what book put you on the path where you are? I would say it was the first time I picked up a Georgette Heyer, because she had that incredibly intelligent approach to writing that worked for me, that I could analyze. The other thing, of course, was Jane Austen. I read Jane Austen over and over and over and over. And I read it in a very, Jane Austen was not frightening. My father was always talking about poetry, but you didn't rewrite Yeats, right? You just admired Yeats. You would read him over and over out loud. And my mother was talking about Tolstoy. You didn't read a Tolstoy novel and say, hey, I could do this much better. But Austen, I would look at Pride and Prejudice and I was like, you know what? I don't really like her. I think I could do better. She wasn't frightening. And I think that may be one of the reasons why romance is one of the great meritocracies we have left. It's a place where you don't have to have graduated from Harvard, Oxford, and Yale. You don't have to have done that to write romance. You can be Nora Roberts and own 2 mountains and half of America, yeah, without a degree. So, thank you. Yes.
So I'm a big proponent of being well-rounded, and you can have all kinds of interests. So I'm a big romance reader. I'm also a big fan of Shakespeare and of Catch-22.
Great.
That being said, so do your students at Fordham know who you are on the side? And if so, what are their reactions generally when they first find out?
It's getting harder now, right? because I just had a friend come, and I have now become part of the Fordham tour, apparently. So they pause outside my office and say, she's in there, and I'm like, ugh. That makes it hard for me to keep it undercover. So what usually happens on day one of Shakespeare, I'm teaching Shakespeare text and performance right now, is someone comes up, some wisecracker, and he says, if I read Much Ado About You, which is my book, can I have extra credit? And I say, I'm Professor Bly to you, and you might want to go look at rateyourprofessor.com and look at how I grade. That works pretty well. I can usually get about 5 or 6 of them out of the class on the first day. I mean, interesting things are happening, and it changes every year. So now I am getting a lot of students. I've always got a lot of students whose mother told them to take Shakespeare. Now I'm getting a lot of students whose mother told them to take Eloisa James. And this, it does create a little tension in the classroom. But I have to say, I much agree with your reading policies. I read everything myself. And I think it's what, if you're a writer, that's what makes you a great writer, reading literature. Okay. Anybody else? We're all too, no? Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.